Hear signals from within that have always been there but were drowned out by the constant noise of external engagement. You're developing sensitivity to aspects of your own experience that require absolute quiet to detect. This is delicate work. It can't happen while you're simultaneously managing other people's emotional needs, expectations, or interpretations of your behavior. The exhaustion doesn't come from people themselves. It comes from the continuous effort of maintaining emotional openness while the internal system is asking for temporary closure. This is nervous system fatigue, not social fatigue. Your sympathetic nervous system has been on high alert, not because of external threat, but because internal reorganization creates its own form of activation. The body doesn't distinguish between external danger and internal transformation. Both require resources, both demand attention, both create a state of heightened sensitivity. When you're in this state, every interaction, no matter how benign, registers as additional demand on an already maxed out system. Someone asks how you're doing, and it's not just a simple question. To answer authentically requires accessing your internal state, translating it into language, calibrating your response to the relationship and context, managing their reaction, and maintaining coherence throughout the exchange. That's an enormous amount of processing for a system that's already running multiple intensive operations in the background. So you start avoiding. Not because you don't care, not because you're becoming antisocial, but because your nervous system is triaging, and it has decided that internal integration takes precedence over external connection. This is adaptive, not pathological. The exhaustion you feel is the signal that you're respecting a biological imperative, not violating a social contract. Ainsworth observed this in emotionally mature people who, without apparent crisis, began to withdraw. They reduced meetings, decreased messages, avoided long conversations. Externally, it looked like distancing. Internally, it was reorganization. Take the example of a woman in her late 30s who had always been the connector in her friend group, the one who organized gatherings, remembered birthdays, checked in regularly. Then over the course of several months, she gradually became less available. She stopped initiating plans. Her responses became shorter, less frequent. Her friends worried. Some felt hurt. A few got angry, interpreting her withdrawal as judgment or superiority. But from her internal perspective, something completely different was happening. A long-held identity structure was dissolving. The person she had been, the way she had related to others, the assumptions she had made about what mattered, all of it was becoming unstable. She wasn't choosing to withdraw. She was being withdrawn by a process larger than her conscious intentions. Ainsworth would recognize this pattern immediately. This woman wasn't developing avoidant attachment. She was temporarily reducing external attachment demands so that her internal attachment to self could reorganize at a more secure, more authentic level. The friends who could tolerate this without making it about themselves, who could hold space without demanding explanation, those were the relationships that survived and deepened. The ones who needed constant reassurance or interpreted her silence as abandonment, those relationships either ended or had to be completely renegotiated later. This moment corresponds to the archetype of affective withdrawal, the phase when external bonding decreases so that internal bonding can strengthen. It's not loneliness. It's emotional incubation. In Jungian terms, this would be the movement into the hermit phase, the necessary retreat that precedes individuation. Every wisdom tradition recognizes this pattern: the vision quest, the walkabout, the dark night of the soul, the desert fathers and mothers withdrawing from society. These aren't random cultural practices. They're recognition of a fundamental psychological truth. Transformation requires temporary separation from the collective. You cannot become who you're meant to be while constantly referencing who others need you to be. The self that's trying to emerge needs protection from external definition, external expectation, external interpretation. It's too fragile, too unformed, too vulnerable to be exposed before it has consolidated. This archetype appears in your life not as conscious choice but as irresistible pull. You don't decide to need silence. you discover that you already need it, that you've perhaps needed it for longer than you realized, and that fighting it only creates more suffering. The wisdom is in recognizing the archetype when it arrives, in understanding that you're not sick or broken or failing at relationships. You're in a specific phase of development that has its own requirements, its own timeline, its own internal logic that doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. Silence doesn't come to isolate. It comes to allow the psyche to expand without interruption. All profound expansion begins as something too fragile to be shared. Consider what happens when you try to describe a dream immediately upon waking. The act of putting it into words often causes it to disintegrate, to lose the texture and meaning it had when it was still purely internal. The same is true for emerging aspects of self. When you try to explain what's happening to you before it is fully formed, you end up distorting it, flattening it, reducing it to concepts and language that don't actually capture the experience. And worse, you begin to see yourself through others' interpretations before you've fully understood it yourself. Their confusion becomes your confusion. Their concern becomes your doubt. Their need for you to be who you were interferes with your becoming who you are. Silence protects against this. It creates a container where the new self can take shape without being prematurely forced into forms that don't fit. It allows you to have experiences, process emotions, reorganize beliefs, and integrate insights without having to simultaneously make it legible to others. This doesn't mean you'll never share. It means you're protecting the gestation process until what's emerging is strong enough to withstand external contact. By respecting this silence, the person isn't abandoning bonds. They're preventing the new internal structure from breaking before it stabilizes. What emerges afterward is more whole, more secure, less dependent. This is the crucial point that others often can't see. From outside, it looks like someone is drifting away, becoming distant, perhaps even cold. But internally the opposite is happening. The person is moving toward a more authentic, more stable, more genuinely secure way of being in the world. The relationships they return to from a different place, not from need or habit or unconscious pattern, but from genuine choice and clarity. The dependency that characterized earlier relating patterns has been metabolized. The performance, the people-pleasing, the automatic adaptation to others' expectations, all of that has been examined and released. What remains is connection that comes from fullness rather than emptiness, from desire rather than desperation. But none of that can happen if the silence is violated too early. If the person is pressured to return before the process is complete, they'll either comply and abort the transformation, or they'll have to withdraw even more completely to protect what's still forming. The people who love someone going through this have a difficult task. They have to trust a process they can't see, respect a timeline they don't control, and tolerate their own anxiety about the relationship without making it the other person's responsibility to manage. The soul asks for silence because it is reorganizing attachment patterns, expanding emotional identity, cannot sustain excessive stimulation, and needs to integrate before returning to connection. Let's break this down structurally. First, attachment reorganization. Your template for how relationships work, what safety feels like, how much of yourself to reveal, when to reach out and when to pull back. All of this was established early and has been operating largely unconsciously. When it begins to shift, when you start relating to yourself and others from a different internal position, the system needs time to rewire. You can't do that while simultaneously maintaining the old patterns. Second, identity expansion. Who you understood yourself to be is no longer adequate to contain your actual experience. You're becoming aware of aspects of yourself that don't fit the narrative you've been carrying. This creates cognitive and emotional dissonance that requires processing. Third, stimulation, intolerance. Your nervous system is already activated by the internal changes. Additional external input, even positive input, registers as overload. You need to reduce incoming data so you can process what's already happening. Fourth, integration before connection. You have to consolidate these changes internally before you can express them externally. If you try to relate from the new place before it's stable, You'll either revert to old patterns or create confusion for yourself and others. If you're feeling this need for absolute silence, there's nothing wrong with you. It's not regression. It's not coldness. It's not dysfunctional detachment. It's a sign of internal expansion and progress. The psychiatric and psychological establishment often misses this because the diagnostic criteria for depression and avoidant disorders include many of these same behaviors. Reduced social contact, decreased interest in activities, withdrawal from relationships, difficulty experiencing pleasure. But context and internal experience matter enormously. If you're withdrawing because everything feels meaningless and gray, because you've lost capacity for joy, because you're convinced you're worthless and people are better off without you, that's depression. If you're withdrawing because your internal world has become more vivid and demanding, because you're processing insights and emotions that feel significant, because you need space to integrate rather than space to hide, that's transformation. The behaviors might look similar from outside, but the internal reality is completely different. Unfortunately, the people around you, even trained therapists, might not be able to distinguish between these states without your ability to articulate what's happening. And if you're in the middle of the process, you might not have clarity yourself. This is why trusting your own experience becomes so important. You know if there's something growing inside you or something dying. You know if the silence feels like preparation or surrender. You know if you're moving toward something or away from everything. You don't need to force yourself to explain. You don't need to prove emotional presence. When the soul asks for silence, respecting it is maturity. This is perhaps the hardest part for people who care about you to accept. They want to understand. They want reassurance. They want to help. And you explaining what's happening, maintaining connection, proving you still care, all of that would make them feel better. But it would come at a cost to you, a cost to the process that's trying to unfold. Maturity isn't always about meeting others' needs. Sometimes it's about having clear enough boundaries to protect your own developmental process even when others don't understand or approve. This doesn't make you selfish. It makes you responsible for your own growth in a way that actually serves your relationships long term. The person who emerges from this silence will be more capable of genuine intimacy, more present, less reactive, more honest, but only if the process is allowed to complete. If you abandon it halfway through because you couldn't tolerate others' discomfort, you'll end up resentful and stuck, and the relationships you were trying to preserve will suffer anyway. Trust that the people who are meant to stay in your life will be able to weather this period. Trust that the ones who can't weren't aligned with who you're becoming anyway. And trust your need for silence is legitimate even if you can't fully articulate why. Afterward, contact returns, but from a different place, simpler, more selective, less anxious, without urgency. The relationships that resume don't pick up where they left off. They begin again from the new internal structure you've developed. Some people will recognize the shift immediately. They'll feel the difference in your presence, the groundedness, the clarity. These will be easy reconnections. Others will struggle because they want the version of you they knew before. They'll push you to perform in familiar ways, to meet old expectations, to slot back into established patterns. These relationships will either evolve or end. You won't force either outcome. You'll simply show up as you are now and let reality unfold. What you'll notice most is the absence of urgency. Before, there was often an anxious quality to your connections, a need to maintain them, to prove your care, to prevent abandonment or conflict. Now, relationships exist in a more neutral space. You're connected because connection feels right, not because you're managing anxiety. You reach out when you genuinely want contact, not when you think you should. You're honest about your capacity without guilt. You disappoint people sometimes without spiraling into shame. This isn't coldness or indifference, it's security. It's the fruit of the silence you protected. Not all silence is empty. Some people fall silent because they're growing. And true growth doesn't happen in constant exposure. The world tells you that growth requires visibility, accountability, community support, external validation. But the deepest transformations happen in private. They happen in the spaces between words, in the long pauses when you're not performing for anyone, in the moments when you're just sitting with yourself and letting reality be what it is without needing to explain or defend it. This isn't antisocial. This is how the self becomes itself. Every person who has undergone significant psychological development can point to periods of withdrawal that preceded breakthrough. The mistake is thinking withdrawal is the problem, rather than recognizing it as part of the solution. Your soul's request for silence is an invitation to a different way of being, one that doesn't require constant external reference, one that trusts internal knowing more than collective opinion, one that values depth over breadth and authenticity over approval. When you honor that request, when you give yourself permission to disappear from the social world for as long as necessary, you're not abandoning life. You're preparing to live more fully than you ever have before. This space exists for people who understand this process. If this resonated with something you've been experiencing but couldn't name, don't just passively consume this and move on. Leave a comment right now describing what your soul's silence feels like. Use this space to articulate what you haven't been able to say elsewhere. And if you know someone who's going through this, someone who has pulled back and you haven't understood why, share this video with them, not as pressure to return but as recognition that you see them even in their silence. Hit that subscribe button because we're building something different here. This isn't about productivity hacks or surface-level self-improvement. This is about understanding the architecture of real transformation. Here, silence has a place. Here, withdrawal isn't pathology. Here we recognize that sometimes the most profound growth happens when no one is watching.